It's a basic aspect of our humanity. It's something that we need to do, but it also makes us bored, it makes us tired, and it can make us sick. It produces everything that we buy and sell, whether it's goods or services, but it's often invisible to us. It's the source of all that has value, of everything that we find joyful or useful in the world. But it's also the thing which causes many of our most serious social problems. This is Keywords, a video series with me, Jacob Mukherjee, convener of MA Political Communications at Goldsmiths. And today, as you've probably realised, we're looking at W for work. What exactly is work? The first thing to say is that work is different to labour. For this, we can go back to Karl Marx. For Marx, work is a fundamental human capacity, part of what he called our species being. The ability to conceive of something in the mind and then work together collectively and purposefully to execute it, to make it a reality, is part of what makes us, humans, different to non-human nature. According to Marx, nature provides the raw materials, but then humans work to transform those materials into something of use to us, to society. So work is a good thing, or at least it can be. But under capitalism, that's the system where a very small minority, the capitalists, own the factories, the shops, the offices, the businesses, what Marx called the means of production, and the rest of us own nothing apart from our ability to work for the capitalists. Work becomes alienated and it becomes labour. In other words, when we as workers sell our labour power to our bosses, we lose control over our own work and surrender that control to our bosses. And while it's our labour that produces value, the bosses take the profits. So that's the basic Marxist account of work and labour. But there's something missing. We've spoken about workers producing goods and services and their labour being the thing that produces value for the capitalist. That all makes sense, but it also leaves out some kinds of work and certain kinds of labour. Let's think about domestic work, things like cooking, cleaning, taking care of the home, looking after children. Of course, in many societies, that's historically work that's performed by women, and in many places it still is today. Now, that kind of labour doesn't directly produce profit for the capitalists, but it is vital work, because without that labour, workers wouldn't be able to rest and recuperate, and also children wouldn't gain the skills and attitudes and knowledge that they need to be able to become workers themselves in future. So domestic labour helps to reproduce the ability of labourers to work, and some Marxist feminists refer to that kind of labour as the work of social reproduction. We can extend that point and say that educating future workers, so the labour of teachers and other educators, as well as the labour of providing healthcare, providing housing, providing food even, all these are forms of social reproduction. Because although they don't generally directly produce profits for the capitalist, they are vital to maintaining capitalism, in the sense that they help to reproduce the ability of labourers to labour. Okay. Let's look at the details of how capitalism and that relationship between bosses and workers shapes the way we labour. Now, someone who studied this in detail is Harry Braverman, who wrote this great book, Labour and Monopoly Capital, in the 1970s. Now, Braverman develops Marx to talk about how the capitalist seeks to control every aspect of the working day, and in the process, degrades and de-skills the worker. As Braverman points out, when workers made goods at home and sold them to the capitalist, as used to happen before industrial capitalism, the workers still maintain a large amount of control over the work process. But once the capitalist contracts and enlists the worker, pays for their time, pays for their labour power, that gives the bosses a big incentive to break work down into its component tasks, both to maximise the amount that workers can produce and also to reduce workers' power over their own labour. Capitalism has drawn upon and developed the scientific management of time and motion in the factory, the office and the shop, to remove control over work from the worker and make sure that everything the worker does, every action, helps to produce value for the bosses. And of course, key to that is the use of technology. Under capitalism, technology isn't used to meet human needs. Rather, it becomes a tool to give capitalists more control of the work process. So bosses don't try to automate their workplaces just so they can produce things more quickly. Automation is also about removing control from the workers, removing their ability to obstruct or slow down the work process. Braverman quotes workers in factories and offices in the 60s and 70s in the USA as saying, "We don't operate the machine, we work for the machine. The machine works us." Okay, so that's industrial capitalism. But what you might be wondering is, how relevant is any of this today? Doesn't this conventional Marxist account of labour under capitalism need updating? Well, of course, for many workers around the world, their time and motion is still rigidly monitored and controlled. And in fact, the technologies to do that monitoring and control are now more advanced than ever. But it's also the case that there are many other workers today who cannot be controlled in the way that Henry Ford and other industrial bosses sought to control their employees. Why? Well, partly because of how work has changed. Of course, capitalist economies have always produced services as well as goods, but under contemporary capitalism, service work has become increasingly important. Care workers, bartenders, advertisers, academics, scriptwriters. What we produce through our labour is ideas, experiences, atmospheres, entertainment, cultural goods. The theorist Maurizio Lazzarato uses the concept of immaterial labour to refer to this kind of work. He argues that workers involved in this kind of labour require a degree of autonomy in order for them to work effectively. This is most obvious if you think about artists. Their work involves cooperation and collaboration and taking the initiative and being creative. And so they need to be given some freedom because without autonomy, they can't produce good art and create value. Rather than having their every movement controlled, immaterial labourers work on projects. They manage their own work and collaborate with others, either as direct employees or as self-employed freelancers. In fact, some workers under contemporary capitalism come to think of themselves, in Lazzarato's words, as a fragment of capital, as an entrepreneur, as a small business. So we impose control upon ourselves. And in some ways, that's a far more effective form of control than that imposed by the industrial employer. Now, Lazzarato isn't saying that this is a good thing, and nor is he claiming that these workers are truly free. Far from it. We're now controlled by economic necessity. So, for example, the freelance filmmaker may have some autonomy over how she does her work, but she still needs to pay the rent, which means she needs to meet the demands of her client on time, even if the payment is poor. Furthermore, she has little choice over which projects to accept or refuse. Another way that work has changed is that for many of us, work tends to move outside of just one workplace or one fixed working day. And so the boundaries between work and non-work life tend to blur. We work at work, but we also work at networking drinks after work. We work at home. We work on the train. We work in those casual moments where we look something up on Google while we're waiting for a bus. And of course, thanks to the internet and our mobile devices, we never switch off. And because of all of this, many of us are working way too hard, and yet we're still not earning enough to pay the bills. In fact, today we're faced with a crisis of work. In the USA, since the start of the pandemic, millions of people have voluntarily taken themselves out of the workforce in something that's sometimes referred to as the Great Resignation. Meanwhile, in China, millions of young people in particular are rejecting China's culture of overwork in a movement known as tangping, or lying flat. And perhaps most significantly, in many countries around the world, we're seeing a big increase in strike action. So in the UK, for instance, we've seen more strikes than at any time since the 1980s. With doctors, teachers, railway workers, nurses, postal workers, lecturers, and many others going on strike. Now, the labour of many of these workers, whether they work for public or private organisations, was shown to be essential during the pandemic. And these workers are now demanding more wages and better conditions in return for the value that they produce for society and for the capitalists. So what is the future of work? Well, the key question is, can we gain control over our labour and make work into something that produces collective goods for society rather than profits for the few? Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. Do share it if you have, and remember to support every striking worker. Solidarity and goodbye.